Thank you so much, everybody, for showing up. I'm really excited to see like 116 folks here right now. I'm really excited to be sort of facilitating today's session on crafting competitive grant proposals at primarily undergraduate institutions. As an overview of what we're talking about, I'll start with just a few slides talking about Petroleum Research Fund, which is the funding agency at ACS that I'm a grant program officer for. And then I'll talk for about 25 minutes or so on some general proposal writing advice that our office offers, and I'll sort of tailor this to folks at primarily undergraduate institutions or PUIs where possible. And then I'll have maybe a 10 or so minute break for questions, and then we'll go into the most exciting part of today, which will be our panel discussion. And I'll start us off, and then there will be plenty of time for you to ask the panelists questions as well. To get an idea of who is in the audience today, I wanted to do a quick poll. Hopefully, let me see if I can start this or if my colleague has to. I'm going to try to launch it. Hopefully you see it now. I just want to get an idea of who's in the audience across these different career levels: grad student, postdoc, assistant professor, associate, or full professor, or general sort of other category. And it looks like we're pretty far along. I'll wait another 10 seconds or so. All right. So it looks like there's a pretty good distribution between assistant professor and associate or full, but considering like how many people are across the country are at the associate or full level compared to assistant professor, I'd say like we have a pretty good showing of the assistant professor pool out there. And it's nice to see some postdocs who are possibly contemplating a career at a PUI, and some folks in the other category as well. So thanks for sort of giving me that information, which helps me sort of know what kind of questions we might be getting later on. A little bit about myself. Oops. So I'm Allegra Liberman-Martin. For the last year and a half, I've been a program officer for Petroleum Research Fund, covering organic, synthetic organic, and inorganic chemistry panels. A little bit about my background. I did a PhD in chemistry at Berkeley, co-advised by Don Tilley and Bob Bergman, sort of doing mechanistic organometallic chemistry. I did a postdoc at Caltech with Bob Grubbs, studying organometallic chemistry and polymer chemistry. And for 5.5 years, I was an assistant professor at Chapman University, where I ran a research group studying main group chemistry and catalysis with undergraduates. Chapman is in Southern California. And while at Chapman, I became familiar with Petroleum Research Fund, National Science Foundation, and Research Corporation grant writing. Outside of work, in the last 5 years or so, I've started doing embroidery for fun, and I enjoy cooking and baking, and I really enjoy being outside and especially spending time with my dog, Canoofle, who you can see in the picture here. So to move into our PRF focused portion of today, which is relatively brief. So Petroleum Research Fund, or PRF, occupies sort of a narrow niche of research, I would say, compared to like the federal landscape. So ACS is a nonprofit and PRF is not a federal grant program. We fund fundamental research that is in some way related to petroleum. This means that petrochemicals or their derivatives are involved in the research in some way. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, hydrocarbons straight from an oil well. It could be derivatized versions of these, including CO2, which is considered sort of coming ultimately, a lot of it from petroleum. The most successful PRF grant proposals are a narrowly defined project with a testable hypothesis or hypotheses. And in some way, PRF research, even for undergraduate faculty, needs to be a new direction for the PI. So the extent to which it is a new direction, I would say, is less for undergraduate or PUI faculty compared to their doctoral department colleagues. But in some way, you want to be thinking about how the research is taking your group's research trajectory in a slightly different direction. And it's always worth checking with a program officer before you start writing the proposal to get an idea of how different it has to be. Another aspect of PRF is the proposals are considered by 10 different panels as a part of the PRF committee. So I've shown those here. And so there are 5 program officers, each covering 2 panels. I oversee synthetic organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry, and we have colleagues covering all of these other research areas as well. So if you're thinking about applying to PRF, you want to be thinking about how you can frame your research to sort of fit one of these different disciplines. We offer 4 different grant types, 2 of which are geared toward primarily undergraduate departments. These are departments that either offer bachelor's degrees or master's degrees, but not PhDs. And then those are further subdivided into grant types for folks within the first 5 years of their faculty appointment or after that. And then those grants are either 2 years or 3 years in length. And then for folks that receive a PRF grant in one of the undergraduate categories, we're offering a pilot program at the moment that it offers competitive chance to apply for a supplement of $25,000 to sort of increase the research infrastructure within your department. A little bit about how the PRF review process works, which is a little bit different from some federal agencies. So as an applicant, you would submit your application, and then it takes our office a few months to sort of go through the applications where we're looking, is the application complete? And program officers are checking, is it fundamental research? Is it petroleum relevant? Is it a new direction? And all of these types of things. And then if yes, the proposal or the application gets sent out for external review. And we're looking for at least 3 external reviews ideally. And then the application and those reviews get sent to the 3-person PRF committee members that are a part of the panel that you selected. For example, inorganic chemistry is one of mine. So 3 people on that panel would see your application, the external reviews, and then it is the panel's job to rank proposals and make funding recommendations from there. And then those get approved by the board of directors, and then the funding decision gets sent to the applicants after that. I think that it's a little hard to find on our website, but there's a really useful resource if you're thinking about applying, which is the annual reports. So these get posted usually about a year after the annual report is submitted. And these are useful because it can sort of help you get an idea of like what was considered a new direction for somebody else, and also which scientific panel did they apply to. So the annual reports you can filter by grant type, like undergraduate research or something like that, and you'll be able to see the title of the work, the PI in their institution, which panel they selected. So if you're on the fence between 2 of the different ones, it may help there. And then also like a 2-page PDF summarizing research progress. And then here as well is a good place to sort of look at like, okay, this was funded. What was like, how did they think about the petroleum relevance here, likely, to sort of get an idea of fit as well. So breezing on through so that we have time for our panel, I next want to give some sort of general advice about proposal writing. And the way I'm going to frame this is like, of course, a grant application is going to need a research idea that you're excited about and that you can get your reviewers and other folks in the community excited about. But I'm going to be focusing today on sort of the non-scientific aspects in some ways, like how are you planning your application, how are you organizing your actual proposal, and then like how are you making sure there's sort of a good fit for like where you're sending your application to have a high chance of success. So I won't talk about scientific aspects of selecting a topic, but just briefly in that area, for grant writing, you're sort of thinking a little bit differently than for manuscript writing, which is really driven by novelty and impact. But feasibility is really important for grant writing in a way that isn't really reflected in the manuscript writing process. So for new PIs, this is a new thing to think about. So for novelty, this is finding a current knowledge gap and showing people how you would be addressing it through your grant-funded research. For impact, this is a little different from a manuscript as well, because it's not just the significance to your field, but it's also the significance to the particular funding agency. So Petroleum Research Fund may be excited about something, and Department of Energy may be excited about something very different. So that fit is really important for the impact. And then feasibility is sort of the most practical of the considerations. And this is like time and institutional resources, which is often like, I think one of the most challenging parts for people in undergraduate focused programs is they have more limited time and often fewer institutional resources compared to their sort of R1 colleagues. But so you're thinking about how do you frame your research, thinking about those aspects within your own institutional context and like bringing the strengths of your local environment to highlight them in the application. And so for a competitive grant proposal to possibly be fundable, it sort of has to meet all of these aspects at once, which is sort of a big challenge to take on and can be intimidating, especially in the beginning of the grant writing process. I really want to put in a plug for contacting your program officer early. I should have done this as a faculty member. I would have saved myself a lot of agonizing. But like as a program officer, like what got me excited about leaving faculty life and taking this job was like to be a resource for faculty in the community. So, oh, sorry, it sounds like somebody, Danny, can you mute?
I don't know what
Sorry about
happened
that.
there.
No problem. So we're really here to clarify guidelines, which are sometimes confusing, let you know before you get deep into the writing process how the fit seems for what you're applying for, and also help you to frame the research to make the fit sound better in some borderline cases, like maybe using some words rather than others to make it sound more fundamental versus applied. And then after the whole review process, we can provide sort of behind the scenes insights into the panel's discussion that may not be fully reflected in the materials that you receive. When you're reaching out to a program officer to set up a meeting, I recommend sort of laying out sort of an overview with some level of detail in a paragraph or two on the research topic that you're thinking of applying in, and then also laying it out, how does this meet the agency's mission, and like how do you see that fit? So for Petroleum Research Fund, like how do you view the research as fundamental, relevant to petroleum in some way, and in some way, to some extent, a new direction for your research group? All right, so I I think I sold this as like writing the application, but I really want to talk about planning before we get to the writing aspects, because you want to sort of imagine like possibly before you have your conversation with the program officer, what do you need to think about for the research aspects of your work? So I'm going to think about framing this in terms of what are called the 5 Ws, like who, what, when, where, why, but then also like infused across all of these, thinking about practical aspects like safety and like how you will actually pay for the research with budget. So who is like the research team? Yourself as the principal investigator or co-PI? The people that would be working on it, are they all undergraduates? Are some of them master's students? And then do you need co-principal investigators or collaborators to make the research feasible? What is things like what kinds of experiments are you going to need to perform? What kind of equipment do you need? And then even things like everyday supplies, including laptops or software. When has to do with the time frame. So what time for a 2-year grant? How would you plan out the experiments to occur within those 2 years in sort of a reasonable sounding way? Where gets at sort of your home institution, but also things like travel to present at conferences or for students to present at conferences, and also field work for some disciplines. And then why is sort of the most philosophical of these? And for chemistry grants, this is almost always encompassing scientific impact. But then for some grants, I would say not Petroleum Research Fund, but for some grants such as National Science Foundation, societal impact is important as well. All right, so those are sort of like the research aspects of planning. But then there's also sort of like, how are you actually going to put the entire application process, package together on time aspects? And so I think it's natural to think about the writing that's needed, but I want to convince you that communicating and a plan for communicating is a good idea here as well. So writing is sort of the elements that you would think of. Almost every grant application will have an abstract, a proposal narrative. The formatting of this can differ, but something like this. Things like a CV, or it may be called a bio sketch, a budget and budget justification, and then other documents depending on the particular grant type. But then communicating is, I mentioned talking to the program officer early on to make sure they give you the go-ahead, that it's a good fit. But also, if you have a grants office on campus, I recommend talking to them early to figure out what they need from you when. Like a lot of grants offices will need things a month, certain aspects a month in advance, and they can work with you on the budget. I know not all primarily undergraduate institutions have a formalized grants office. If your institution does not, you should probably ask people early who is going to like sign off on the grant in order to track them down and figure out how you will get their signature as sort of the institutional representative signing off on the grant process. If you are incorporating collaborators or co-principal investigators, make sure you contact them early and align on sort of expectations on how much writing different folks will do and what scientific aspects and experiments different people will offer. And then identifying folks at your institution or through your network who could provide feedback on a draft of your application can be super, super helpful for catching things and coming up with great ideas that you wouldn't think of otherwise. So then like with all of this thinking in mind, this is like a very aspirational timeline, I would say. I think later on we could possibly ask the panelists how long they spend on their grants. I don't think I ever like did it over an entire 6 months when I was doing this myself, but you want to come up with some idea of what aspects you're going to tackle when, in order to get everybody on board that you need to move different things forward, like the budget, which may require more time from your institution, and getting feedback before you click submit in the end. So getting back to this sort of planning and organization aspect that I mentioned at the beginning, some general proposal writing advice that our program officers like to give people is you want people to have an easy time sort of navigating your proposal. These can be sort of long documents, 15 to 25 pages, depending on the formatting. And having a clear structure, like even if something as little as the different sections being labeled A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, it can sort of put people's minds at ease that things have been well thought out and there is a way to get through this document it, from somebody that may be reading it late at night, for example. Using things like bold, italics, or underlining can be really helpful, especially if you use that consistently, but of course don't overuse this or it'll sort of like lose its meaning. Graphics and tables can be super effective. People will sort of naturally be drawn to these and you can convey a lot of information in them. And then following the instructions carefully. For some grants, you may need a section specifically labeled broader impacts, for example, National Science Foundation. For Petroleum Research Fund, unlike a lot of other grant programs, our proposals have to be double spaced. Even little things like that can make a difference. So just as like a quick example of formatting, this is an example of one of my previous grants submitted to the National Science Foundation. I did sort of a mock-up of 3 different ways of using the same text with or without formatting and figures. And I didn't do a poll here just to save time. But my guess is most folks would gravitate toward B or especially C in terms of what they would like to look at. So I would say like the figures, people love color and love to look at them. B does have some bolding and some spacing between the different aims, which sort of helps. But A is just really tough to look at, I would say. So that's just sort of an example of using some of the formatting and figures things that I mentioned. For folks that are pretty new to proposal writing, I want to give you an idea of like what a standard format is that's effective for almost all proposals. So these will generally start with an abstract, or this may be called a project summary. This is sort of an overview of the project, sort of big picture, but also going into a little bit of detail. And I would say this is for Petroleum Research Fund, this is a really important aspect for one reason, which is that when we send out review requests, we send the title and the abstract. And so it can be, if an abstract is a little bit too vague, it can be really hard to find reviewers for a proposal. So having like enough detail, even though it's using somewhat general terms, can really help you get some reviewers more easily, which isn't just a problem for me, but also like the reviewers that you suggest will be more likely to say yes if they find the abstract captivating. This will be followed by something like a background and significance section, which is not an exhaustive study of the literature. You don't want this to go on too long, but this is sort of discussing the relevant literature and framing this around the knowledge gap that you're going to address in the proposal. After that, you'll sort of have specific aims and possibly introduce hypotheses here. When you first introduce the specific aims, you want to keep it pretty brief, 1 to 2 sentences or so on each topic you will investigate. And then you go into all of the details later on, reiterating on these, but giving all of the details about how the work will be done and what you expect later on in the work plan. And then I would say throughout the proposal, you want to incorporate testable hypotheses. I'll discuss hypotheses on the next slide as well. And also give reviewers a sense that you've thought critically about potential challenges and alternative plans if things don't go as expected. So you want to sort of weave those in throughout the work plan. Not all grants and fields of research are framed around hypotheses, but I would say most chemistry fields and most of the Petroleum Research Fund topics that we cover hypotheses are a really effective way to make your work sound fundamental and then also sort of frame your research. So you want the hypothesis to sort of address the knowledge gap that you identified in your introduction, And then the research aims that follow and or incorporate your hypothesis need to actually test it. And so like a well-written hypothesis can give you a good idea of what the rest of the proposal is going to look like. So for example, one hypothesis is we hypothesize that immobilizing photocatalysts on optical fibers is possible without compromising their polymerization activity. In this one sentence, you get a really good idea of what this person is looking at and how their experiments might be designed. They may be looking at polymerization activity with or without the immobilization process. And then it would be really jarring if they didn't do that later on. So they should really do that within the research aims. Or another one, the proposed research hypothesizes that oriented electric fields can accelerate reactions involving anionic fragments. So you get an immediate sense of the big picture, and then the research aims can sort of test these different aspects of the hypothesis and see if it holds up or not. I also mentioned specific aims, which as a reminder, you briefly introduce after sort of the background section, and then you elaborate on them in the research plan. And I would say the number of specific aims that you have depends a lot on the grant you're applying for. For a shorter duration grant with less money, you want fewer specific aims. And so, but for like a 5-year grant with a lot of money, you would want more of these. For Petroleum Research Fund, where our grants are 2 to 3 years, I would say most proposals, most highly competitive proposals have 2 or 3 specific aims because it's not a super long grant period. These aims have to be related enough that people can see the link between them, but you don't want a later aim to completely depend on an earlier one. So I like to use the physics analogy of circuits and light bulbs, where think about the light bulbs as your aim. So in a series circuit, if one light bulb or aim fails, the later ones simply cannot go on. Whereas in a parallel circuit, your aims or light bulbs are related to each other, but if one of them fails, the other ones can still be lit up and can still continue. So you want sort of a relationship between them, but not where the whole thing falls apart if aim one doesn't go according to plan. The way that you put these together, you want it to sort of logically flow, even though their success shouldn't be linked. And then you want to really make sure everything you're proposing is related to the knowledge gap you identified and supporting the overall goals of the projects, nothing too tangential. I know a really stressful subject related to grant writing can be preliminary data, and this really varies a lot based on career stage and also which grant opportunity you're applying for. When reviewers are asking for preliminary data, what they really want is some kind of validation that your idea or approach is feasible and like likely to work. And if you do have preliminary data to include, which may not be possible if you're applying right after you start a new faculty position, if you do have preliminary data to include, make sure that everything you put in supports your hypothesis. If it raises questions about your hypothesis, that can cause reviewers to sort of go off track. Similarly, if the data that you include are pretty speculative, reviewers will sort of latch onto it and comment a lot about that. Like if you give a product without a yield for an organic chemistry project, reviewers will sort of focus on that too much and sort of lose track of the bigger picture. And then I've seen examples where folks had a lot of preliminary data and reviewers sort of questioned whether the grant was even needed, or like if the paper comes out in 1 year, what would they do for the remaining 2 years of the grant? And just to emphasize for PRF specifically, we do not require preliminary data, and we coach our committee members and panelists not to bias in favor of preliminary data. About half of our applications have preliminary data, and about half of our funded proposals do. So our funding rates are sort of similar to, well, what comes into our office. So we're not biased towards funding proposals with preliminary data compared to without. All right, a few more practical aspects of the application process. I put this in here just because I personally love a project timeline. If people can squeeze it in. For some grants where your page count limited, it can be hard to take up space, but for Petroleum Research Fund, you have a word count, not a page count, so you can have as many figures as you want. So you can definitely put in a project timeline. And I just find these can be really helpful to sort of see, like, does the project look feasible when it's mapped out in a visual way? Like, does it seem like it could actually take place within 2 years or 3 years? A couple more application components that are sometimes overlooked. The references section, reviewers will pay a lot of attention to this. And one sort of practical aspect for folks like program officers like myself is please make sure to follow the citation style that's required. We don't want to have to send your proposal back without review for this reason. And then for sort of making sure reviewers don't comment negatively on your references section, make sure you're considering publication years, citing a range of research groups if possible, and then also the journals that you're citing. For PRF, the journals cited can also help you to identify a panel in some cases. Like if you're citing a lot of inorganic chemistry journals, maybe the organic panel is actually not as good of a fit as the inorganic one, for example. And then not all grants, but PRF and many grants will allow you a place to suggest reviewers. This is a part where it's worth thinking about carefully and possibly talking to folks in your network for who they might recommend. I would say the scientific expertise of the reviewers is really important. You want the program officer to be able to tell why you selected that person for a scientific reason, not just sort of, oh, it's another person at a primarily undergraduate institution, but is the research a good enough fit for them to really evaluate your project? Of course, avoid conflicts of interest. You can't really recommend former mentors or mentees or people you've collaborated with in the last 2 years or so. And then for folks at primarily undergraduate institutions, I would recommend suggesting a balance of close to equal numbers of reviewers from primarily undergraduate institutions and doctoral departments who all have a reasonable scientific expertise fit for the research. Oh, Morgan, I see your question and I will answer it in just a few slides. Hopefully that's okay. And then I also see something in the chat, but I can't see it well right now. So hopefully I will get to it later. Before I wrap up, so I talked about the positive things you can do earlier on, sort of common mistakes that program officers see. A big one is a poor fit for the funding agency's mission. But this is where talking to the program officer can really help before you write too much. If an application is disorganized or has grammar or spelling mistakes, reviewers will comment on these things, and some reviewers are really sensitive to them and will give very low scores for something like this. Reviewers will also call out missing citations for relevant literature. And then one way that this can sort of, for early career folks, I would say one way that writing grant proposals differs from sort of the research plan that you submit with your faculty job application is how specific the research plan has to be. So for a sort of a faculty job application, you're giving an overview of like areas you might want to explore within your pre-tenure years. But for a grant proposal, you want to be really, really specific. Like, what will you do with $55,000 in 2 years? And you want to go into a fair amount of detail with that. So having a vague research plan can be a problem. And likewise, if the plan is too ambitious, if it looks like it would take 5 years, but we could only fund 2, that would be a problem as well. So before I open things up to questions, just to quickly reiterate, I sort of talked about projects being fundable being at the nexus or center of overlap between novelty, impactfulness, and feasibility. And as a part of this, you're thinking about alignment with the funding agency's mission, which you can check out by reading their website, looking at what they funded before, but ultimately getting a go-ahead from a program officer can really help. And then the way that you put together your application package, communicating it clearly can make a big difference. So I'm going to stop sharing now so I can see more of my screen and take some questions. I can see some stuff is popping up in the chat, and then I believe it was Morgan raised a hand as well. So let me stop sharing for now so I can navigate a bit better. Okay. It looks like, let's see. Was it Morgan, or could you raise your hand again?
Oh, yeah. I had a question about the proposed reviewers. I was wondering
Yeah.
if you could just speak more to that in terms of the process and kind of what
Yeah.
PRF is looking for that might be different from like a journal review.
I would say it's very similar to a journal review. So I wouldn't worry too much about the difference there. I would say the people most likely to accept review requests are folks in the United States, especially, or in Canada, just because they're most familiar with the PRF grant type. Whereas you can recommend, and we do send review requests to other countries as well, but it's more hit or miss whether or not folks will accept them. So I would say it's very similar to journal review request things. And so for like my sort of process as a program officer, so I'm looking for 3 or more external reviews to get that. And I usually start by sending 6 requests, assuming like hopefully I'll get about a 50% return. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And I'll choose sort of 3 people from your list and 3 people from my list. If your list, I can sort of see the scientific connection well enough. Are there other
Yeah,
aspects
thank
you
you.
want me to address?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Oh, thanks for unmuting. And I see one in the chat, and please feel free to raise your hands with more questions or put more questions in the chat if you have them for me. And then, of course, later on after I introduce the panel, you'll have many opportunities to ask them questions as well. So I see one in the chat. Proposed experiments are based on available instrumentation the PI has been using and is based at least in part on ongoing experiments. How new must the new line of work be? It depends on how you frame it and on your subfield, I would say. So for example, for organic I sort of oversee organic and inorganic chemistry, so I can speak to those. For organic chemistry, a lot of times folks will sort of frame it around looking at a new functional group that their group hasn't looked at before, or like even a new mechanism can work. So for example, if somebody has been doing all radical chemistry and they're going to look at anionic intermediates, they could make an argument that those are fundamentally different mechanisms. And so that's a bit new. I'm going to have like Wade sort of comment on the new direction later on because one of our panelists has applied for undergraduate research grants and sort of thought about that. And so, or versus the inorganic chemists, when they're talking about new directions, they might be thinking more about different types of ligands or a metal from a different part of the periodic table, something like that. So run it by your program officer or have a conversation with them. Just double check what they think new should be before you get too deep into the writing. Let me see a few more questions, and then I want to turn things over to the panel. So for young faculty applying for the UNI, how is the new direction evaluated? Is it just an idea that is different? Yeah, so for the new investigators, it has to be in some way different from your PhD and postdoc research to some extent. And then I see for are multi-institution collaborative proposals allowed? I would say it depends on the grant type. For new investigators, you could have a collaborator, but not a co-PI. But for the undergraduate research category for like more established faculty, they could have a co-PI or collaborators, but I would say it's not a ton of money. So I would say multi-institution, I would go for like maybe 2 at most. I wouldn't go to like 3 or 4 or 5 or something like that, like a big center. Christy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. I have a silly question. So many years ago, when I was a junior faculty, I tried to apply this grant. However, I have very harsh reviewer because I proposed the meta-organic frameworks. And my proposal was looked down by a kind of big name. They said, oh, a small school like us, how can we have facility to do a metallic frame or something like that? And women scientists, we need a, say if we got pregnant, how can we do research? So I dared not to send more application to this. So I just got to say my project eventually get supported by NSF.
Got
so
it.
I'm just curious for this kind of PRF, this kind of proposal, should we propose a small project? Then we may not get looked down by some people. Oh, how can you do research at a small school like that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you want it to be like ambitious for your context, but still really be like think deeply about what your group could accomplish with the amount of money, how many 2 or 3 undergraduates a year or something like that for 2 or 3 years, depending on the grant type. You do want it to sound realistic. But I mean, I wouldn't shy away from certain research topics necessarily. I would just, it can often help to have a sentence or two talking about, your group has already worked, had some success with metal organic frameworks or something like that, in order to sort of put people's minds at ease. I did that back when I was still applying for grants because my group was working with really, really air sensitive chemicals. So people would naturally tend to worry, like, how could an undergraduate possibly work with this? So I would often say, our group has already developed protocols for handling these air sensitive materials, and I regularly train undergraduates in these techniques, and then people wouldn't comment on it as much. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. What you mentioned, they still need to consider the possible facility to do it. They will still consider that, correct? But we have to try our best to tell them we do have the background or something to do the research, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just sort of convincing them of that. And without taking up a lot of space, even just mentioning things like we have this key characterization technique for free on campus or something like that can like put people's minds at ease, whereas otherwise they might be worrying, like, would you have to travel or something like that?
Yes, thank you. Last question is very fast. Sorry to bother you again. So my question is, could I use the money to hire a technician instead of undergraduate students? Because I have enough money for undergraduate, however, I need some money to hire a technician or lab manager, that kind of stuff.
Oh, no,
Just
I
for
think,
1 year.
yeah, no, unfortunately,
Oh.
it's specifically for student support. So it would need to be a student.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Let me quickly look in the chat. I know some of them are coming in and I may need to post a Q&A later. I will not get to all of the questions. But I see, let me see. All right, I see one about the right fit for the scientific panel. Like, does one program officer redirect a proposal to another program officer if one thinks they would be a better fit or chance? From Anna Yang. Unfortunately, we cannot redirect them like internally. We would have to like return it without review and then tell you to reapply to the other panel in the next cycle, which sort of takes, it sort of sets back your application by 6 months. So I would say I would like check with the program officers before applying, if at all possible, so that that doesn't happen. And then Joseph.
Yeah. I just had a quick question about preliminary data. You had
Yeah.
mentioned that it should all effectively support the hypothesis that's outlined in the new direction. Is it looked down upon to have data in there, let's say from a current direction, that shows that, I don't know, you know how to use IR spectroscopy as a silly example to characterize something that you're currently working on. The same
Got it.
things could be used for what you're proposing. Is that kind of data useful or not?
You could try putting it in, but I would have somebody read it and ask them if they find it distracting, because often as soon as you have a figure, people will latch onto it and then be like, oh, looking at that and being like, what is this carbonyl doing here? I thought they were studying amines. So I would try incorporating it, but like specifically ask somebody to look at that section and say if it who you trust would give you a real answer, and ask them if it's distracting or not. You don't want to like get people off on it. You don't want the reviewers to fixate and cause trouble.
Sure.
So thank you for putting so many questions in the chat. I want to have time for the panel. So I'm going to pause the questions now and introduce our panelists. Could we, Helena, if you're there, can you make us all large? Okay, thank you. All right, so we have 3 panelists here today. The first of which is Daniela Arias-Rotondo, who is an assistant professor of chemistry at Kalamazoo College. We also have Wade Downey, who is professor of chemistry and Clarence E. Danoon Jr. Chair of Natural Sciences at the University of Richmond. And we have Leslie Hamachi, who is assistant professor in the chemistry and biochemistry department at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. To start us out, I wanted our panelists to just briefly sort of share their general research area, their experience writing grant proposals, and 2 tips you would pass along to those writing proposals. And then if there's anything like unusual about grant writing support offered by your college or university, feel free to share that as well. Dani, can you start us off?
Yes. Hi. So I am a synthetic inorganic chemist. I work on coordination chemistry, mostly looking at photoactive complexes of first-order transition metals. My experience writing proposals, I would say it was very minimal before I started my current position. So I had like written a dissertation, written papers, but I didn't really know how to sell your science. And at first I was really bad at it. And ever since I started here, like I've attended any workshop that would like give me any tidbits on how to do this. And that was actually really, really useful.
Okay.
here at Kalamazoo College, we don't have much support for writing. So we do have like a person, I don't remember the exact title, but there are a couple of people who work with grants, and they are the ones who will like sign off when you submit a grant proposal. But there's little in the way of someone reading your proposal unless you ask for other people. We don't have so it's a blessing and a curse, because the nice thing is I've submitted my proposals pretty much like the day off, but pretty much, I mean, I've submitted my proposals the day off, and then I had to kind of track down the provost being like, hey, can you please sign these, because I have a half hour, right? So that's not great, but it did happen. But we don't have a lot of support in the sense of how to do these things.
Got it.
Then you were asking for like 2 tips for people.
Yeah.
Yeah. First one, I would say apply to all the things, right? Like there is limited funding. There's a ton of people who are trying to apply to all the different things. So any opportunity you have, apply to it, because also the worst that can happen is you end up with 2 agencies wanting to fund the same project, which is a great problem to have, and you might have to turn one of them down. But like, yes, you have to manage your time and your effort, but apply to all the things, right? Being careful and doing a good job, or as good a job as you can at applying, but apply to all the things. And have a couple of trusted people, preferably who have successfully gotten grants funded, read your stuff. Like, you don't want to be the only person reading these before it goes out. You need a couple of people to read it, like really, really, really. And the other thing, I will echo what Allegra said before, talk to your program officer. Like just call them, pester them, like ask them for different questions. They're super, super helpful.
Oh, thank you.
I think that covers all the things, right?
It's been helpful.
Yeah, I know it really is. It's been really, really helpful for me.
Okay, great. Wade, could you go next?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having us on the panel. This is really, I think this should be really educational for folks, hopefully. My name's Wade Downey. I'm at the University of Richmond. I've been here for 20 years, studying mostly Lewis acid catalyzed synthetic organic methods, especially with TMS triflate is the major promoter for what we've been doing. I've got a lot of experience writing grant proposals. I've been successful for less than half. So you've just got to keep putting those proposals out there. So support from my university. We have a grants officer who's great about checking to make sure that you've checked all the boxes, that you've got the budget lined up the way the granting agency wants it to be lined up. But sort of like Danny said, there's no one who comes through and checks over your proposal for you for scientific merit. That's where you really need someone who's in your field to help with that. In addition to that, I've got one big tip that I would have for anyone writing a grant, and this is coming from my experience as a reviewer as much as it is a grant writer. Show promise beyond the lifetime of the grant. It's not very exciting for me to see a very specific project that comes to a defined end after 2 years, and then you think, what is this researcher going to do after that? So you want to have that endpoint that you can get to by the end of the grant that shows that you've accomplished something, but you also want to show that whatever it is you're doing is going to branch out and be really successful in hopefully a lot of other areas as you move forward. Show that this is not just the end of your career, but it's a jumping off point that's going to push you in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that's especially true for Petroleum Research Fund, which sort of likes to think of itself as seed funding to sort of get a project started, but then hopefully apply to National Science Foundation afterwards once you've gotten some preliminary results or something. So I think that type of framing can make a really big difference. And then Leslie, can you go next, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Hamachi. I'm an assistant professor at Cal Poly, and I do materials chemistry research, specifically working on colloidal covalent organic frameworks. And my experience writing grant proposals, I hadn't written any grants before starting my position, but I've since tried to apply for at least one grant, write at least one grant proposal per year. And so just as a strategy as an assistant professor, I tried to identify what sorts of opportunities would be available and then not to kind of overburden my calendar with too many applications. So I guess try to pace yourself is one tip. My college it provides some grant writing release time that we have to apply for. It's a competitive process, but that's nice if your university can offer similar release time from teaching, because that's difficult to try to balance all of your other responsibilities with also writing grant proposals. And then some tips that I would pass along to people. One thing that I didn't hear mentioned, but since there was some interest about the reviewers, for the ACS PRF, there's this note that you cannot suggest the same reviewer that you have previously suggested in the past 4 years. So when I was putting together my first PRF proposal, I was trying to think, what are all the list of possible people that I could suggest? And then I tried to save a couple people that would be really good reviewers just in case I had to resubmit. And I did end up having to resubmit, which I think we'll get to in one of the later questions. But like trying to be strategic if there are any sort of quirks to a particular application, such as the PRF wanting you to suggest a whole different slate of reviewers. So that would be one kind of tip for people trying to apply for the PRF.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, so PRF wants to make sure, so the reason for that is that PRF wants to make sure that the external reviewers are looking at it with a fresh set of eyes, because the panel is likely very similar to last time. Our panelists serve 3-year terms. It's like an ACS committee. So the panel has sort of the institutional memory, and so we want the reviewers to bring something new to it. But yeah, it does create an issue if you're thinking about a second resubmission. You're getting to 18 different people you've had to suggest over 3 submissions. It's getting pretty challenging. And so I'm going to start us off with a couple of questions, but please start putting questions in the chat. And then I'll say to our panelists, not everybody has to answer both of these questions, but jump out there if you would like to. But I wanted to put forward, did you receive the first grant you applied for? And Leslie sort of alluded to this. And if not, what did you learn from that first grant rejection experience?
I guess I can go first to
Yeah.
continue with my previous thoughts. So the first grant that I applied for was actually the PRF UNI. And so I was not successful with that application. And I think what I had tried to propose, people really wanted a lot more feasibility. I think that was something Allegra mentioned earlier. But that was really important because as somebody proposing to do materials research at a PUI, we need lots of characterization of these materials. And I think this gets back to Christine's question from earlier, working on metal organic frameworks. So I also work on porous frameworks. And so lots of reviewer comments were asking if it was feasible or possible to do this at a PUI. And so what I kind of took from that was that I would really need to include a lot more preliminary data or just some sort of sense of the feasibility, mentioning the instruments that we have available, mentioning that I have a track record of training students on these instruments. And I think inclusion of preliminary data, at least for MOFs or COFs or other materials, is kind of really important, because otherwise reviewers who half of them may be from PUIs, half of them may be from R1 institutions, they won't really know if you have the facilities unless you have some sort of demonstrated track record of publishing on that topic at your institution, or some sort of preliminary data to show that these types of experiments that you're doing are feasible. And also my first PRF UNI submission, I had this crazy idea that it was like, if this would work, this would be amazing. But a lot of the reviewers correctly pointed out some technical issues that might pop up. And so I've kind of found that I've been the most successful when I've been applying with the strongest, most fleshed out ideas. So things that are not too exploratory, unless I have like really good rationale or preliminary results to say, hey, this actually is very feasible and will likely turn into like a publishable project down the road.
Thanks. Danny or Wade, do you have anything you want to add for this one?
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No,
Dan.
go ahead, Wade.
Thanks. I have one really quick thing, and that is the first PRF proposal I wrote was not funded, but I got some pretty positive reviews back, and being able to pay attention to what those reviewers said was really useful. And I also called the program officer to talk about the reviews, and my program officer was super helpful and very encouraging at the time, and said, you did really well in the pool, you just weren't funded, so you should definitely apply again. So it's just another plug for getting in contact with your program officer.
Yeah, it's kind of what I was going to say. My first application was also the PRF, and I didn't get it. And looking at the reviews was very useful, and trying to kind of look at them with a level ahead as I could, because trying not to get upset at the reviewers. And then after reading them, talking to the program officer was very useful. And I will say, like, this is just like a little story, but my proposal was dealing with, my group does a lot of manganese chemistry, and one of the people reading my proposal, like one of the reviewers mentioned cobalt as if I was working on cobalt, and I was so upset, right? Like, did you even read this? And so this goes back to something that Allegra said earlier, which is you really need to help your reviewers read the things. And so having a very structured proposal and using like highlight and bold or like those kinds of things really helps, because as Allegra said, these people are going to be reading these proposals late at night, because that's when we review things. So those, like, looking at the things that people didn't understand about my proposal really helped me to see where I hadn't explained things well. Kind of what Leslie was saying about feasibility and things like that. Like, sometimes in your head it makes perfect sense, but when someone else is reading it, and so really looking at what the reviewers are saying, not to get upset about it, but to really say, okay, clearly, even though I thought I had explained this well, if more than one person didn't understand it, I didn't do a good job of explaining it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it definitely, once you get the reviews back, I would recommend, let them sit for a few days, and then, don't even when you read them, don't email your program officer right away. Let them sort of simmer, and then go sort of line by line, seeing like, okay, what can I address? And instead of getting frustrated with the reviewer, try to think about it like, oh, maybe it wasn't clear. Sometimes the reviewer is just genuinely frustrating, but like, are there ways it could have been clearer? And yeah, Leslie's point about the different reviewers and feasibility for undergraduate institutions is really interesting. I would say, as somebody behind the curtain, it's very interesting. Like, some people at R1s are, question if things are possible at undergraduate institutions, but sometimes they are so amazed that you've written a proposal like at all, and they're like, oh my gosh, like this would lead to publications, this is amazing. And then sometimes other folks at PUIs are really critical about certain techniques or something like that. So it's a little bit all over the place, I would say. But to appease everybody, I would say showing feasibility is extra appointment for folks applying from undergraduate programs. And then I see one question coming in the chat. I would love more, but in the meantime, for our panelists, does anybody have any thoughts on my question about what do you think is the biggest challenge when applying for grants from a PUI? Or is it just like, is it all you've ever known? So who knows? Any thoughts?
I think we touched upon this a little bit before. Sorry, I don't remember if it was Wade or Leslie who mentioned it, but or maybe it was you, Allegra, with the slides. But like how much you can get done at a PUI is different. And so what I've found that is very useful for me is being strategic about collaborations, right? Like really saying, okay, these things I'm gonna do with these people, right? And you don't have to have every aspect of the collaboration lined up, but you have to be able to say, this person can do this experiment for me, and here's the letter where it says that they will, right? And so thinking about like really showing your reviewers that you can do these things that you are saying. And sometimes you have to kind of adjust your expectations on how long is it going to take to do this or that. But also a mistake that I made at the beginning when I was writing proposals, and one of my colleagues really helped me with, was not trying to apologize, right? Like don't apologize for being at a PUI. Like you can still do really good science. It might take a bit longer, or you may not be able to do all the things all the time, but you can do really good things. So don't start by being like, well, this is going to be crappy because we're at a PUI, right? And again, to me, finding the collaborators has been really, really useful, because sometimes like my group is pretty good at synthesis, but there are some characterization techniques that we can't do in-house. And so having those people lined up, and in general, all my positive reviews have mentioned how we have good collaborations lined up. So that really helps.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really helpful advice. Leslie?
So yeah, to kind of echo what Danny said, I've found that the biggest challenge for me is knowing how to budget and spend my time in the way that's the most effective, because any time that I spend on grant writing, I'm then not spending on writing papers. And then any time that I'm doing these things, I'm not spending on being in the lab mentoring the students. And then all of this is on top of an already kind of heavy teaching load that we all know it can kind of balloon to fill the space and time that you give it. And so that's a challenge that I'm currently facing, and I don't really have any answers to how best to budget my time. But yeah, I think that's trying to figure out the trade-offs of your time and what's the most.
Yeah, I see folks nodding along. I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people. Wade, any thoughts?
Yeah, for me, the biggest challenge of really doing research at a PUI is finding something that can be impactful enough that my students can do. And I think that's the big question that all of us at PUIs are wrestling with all the time. Convincing reviewers from R1 institutions has been difficult for me. I think my impression from the reviews I've seen, people from other PUIs are generally very positive. And as Allegra was saying, some people from the R1s are like, wow, I can't believe you're doing anything. This is fantastic. And other people are saying, why didn't you use this $350 a gram ligand to put on your air sensitive catalyst in your glove box? And I'm like, I have none of those things. So that's a challenge. I think it's one we're all aware of, but it's a tricky thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. All right, thank you. So I see, I'm going to go in sort of the order that I received them. So one from the chat and then Natalia with a hand raised. So from Julianne in the chat, Wade, I think this one is going to be for you specifically. For UR, does it help or hurt to have a paper already published, like for example, a communication showing proof of concept preliminary data? So I guess like that question, as well as like generally, how have you thought about, as somebody that I believe has applied for multiple URs, like how do you sort of think about differentiating them?
Yeah, I think any sort of record you have beforehand helps, as long as your grant is taking another step and a significant step beyond that.
Okay.
You get demonstration, especially for the UR, that you have a group that's already established, that you can do communicable science. I think that's really important, and it gives the reviewers confidence that, you know, we're spending $70,000 on you. We want to see something come out of it. And even if that's something that, you know, and this is one thing we talk about with grants sometimes, and PRF is great about this, that you come into PRF with a proposal for some idea, and then that exact idea doesn't work, and you can shift focus a little bit, especially if it's some result that came out of what you were trying to do. And then you're successful in that, then PRF is super supportive of that. And the fact that you have, you know, maybe a communication that's come out beforehand that shows that you're a successful scientist means that if the project you're working on here doesn't quite work out for one reason or another, we're confident you can shift gears and get something productive out of the money that we're giving you.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Julianne, let us know if you have any, like a follow-up or if we've addressed your question. And then Natalia, do you want to unmute?
Yes. Hi, Leslie, Danny, Wade, thanks so much for doing this. This might have been touched on in some of the other larger questions, but one of the things in the planning stages I'm struggling to deal with is the scope of the project, especially for something like the PRF, which is smaller. Thinking about things in terms of one hypothesis with a couple aims is helpful, but if there's any thoughts that you had on, like, is this one paper, is this two papers? Granted, papers can be all number of sizes and scope as well. And also, is this a project that like 1 to 2 students, or how many people do you have working on this type of project that gets covered in one grant? Again, how many students you have on one project can vary depending on the types of undergraduate institution you're at. But any thoughts on that would be really helpful. Thank you.
I guess it depends a bit on the budget, right? Because you have to have, if I remember correctly, 40% has to go to students. So that already means that you are going to be supporting a significant number of students. So I think I had budgeted for like 2 students per summer, 2-3 students per summer. So that's like 4 to 6 students for one of these grants. Plus maybe some more during the school year. If you like in the school year, you don't have them for nearly as much. So maybe you can have a couple more, right? And like maybe it takes 3 students to do the work of one during the school year. But I was thinking about it from that point of view, of like whenever I write proposals, and when I think about projects, I always try to think about like how many students do I need for each of the things and how am I going to divide the work. That helps me plan.
Yeah, and that sounds about right compared to what I've seen folks at undergraduate schools, especially if they're not budgeting for master's students. I see typically 2 or 3 students a summer for PRF grants.
And I think one thing that I would add, Natalia, so at least in my experience, I've kind of found that since the PRF is much smaller in scope than, say, an NSF grant, for PRF, the reviewers seemed okay with me, writing a cough colloid proposal, but then there's one aim really focused on the synthesis, one aim really focused on some of these characterizations using electron microscopy, and I forget what my other aim was, but like things that might have been condensed into one aim for an NSF proposal, I was able to kind of, hey, these are actually the different aims of the PRF. So, but I think it is kind of specific to exactly what you're suggesting. And I did try to make there are these clear things that we're trying to test in these different, the synthesis part, the characterization part, etc. So hopefully that's helpful.
Let me see. I see one more. Or Wade, did you have anything you wanted to add? Okay. I see another question in the chat, and please feel free to add more questions. We've got 13 minutes left, so feel free to raise your hand or add questions to the chat. Giovanni in the chat is asking, have any of you found it useful to read grants submitted to the sponsor you are aiming for? Do you know of any other grant databases such as ogrant.org? I haven't heard of that one, where one can read grants to get inspiration for grant structure. Oh, I like this question. I will put in a plug for like reaching out to program officers to express interest in reviewing. That's a good way to get an idea. Wade's laughing at me. People don't often volunteer to review, so it would be very exciting. But actually, if you're early in your career, I think reviewing can help you identify what's good and bad in different things. But let me turn it over to you three.
Sorry, go ahead, Leslie.
Oh, I've just found it super helpful, especially as an assistant professor starting out, because you've never really seen what this type of document looks like before. I personally tried to reach out to people in my network to see if anybody was willing to share examples of grant proposals that they had submitted. And yeah, like the format is slightly different between the PRFs versus the NSFs versus really any type of proposal. So I do highly find it useful and encourage you to reach out to people. And sometimes they'll even post a list of the prior awardees. And so you can try to look through that and see if there's anybody that you might have some sort of connection to that you could try to reach out to.
Yeah, I would second what Leslie said. PRF, Dreyfus, NSF, I think they all publish to some extent who've won their awards. Also at conferences, if you guys are going to national conferences or even if you're going to regional or local conferences, you can sometimes meet people who you might ask to read a proposal of yours, or who, if they've been successful themselves, when they put their last slide up in their talk, their acknowledgement slides, and you see ACS PRF up there, you might think, hey, here's somebody who's in a related field to me, who's done well. Maybe they'll show me their proposal. I've had people contact me and ask me for a recent proposal a few times, and I'm happy to do that. Oh, and sorry, and the reviewing, which is a lot of work, is super useful because you see things in proposals that other people have written that don't work well, and you think, oh, I do that too. I wish I had done this or phrased this another way. So becoming a good critic makes you a much better writer.
It is a lot of work, though. Danny, did you want to add anything? Okay, that's fine. Greg, do you want to unmute? I see your hand raised.
Hi, I was wondering if the panelists could comment on how they related their work to petroleum products. Earlier in my career, and still certainly somewhat now, I studied remediation and oil spills, and so that was not something that would be PRF funded, but so one, I'm sort of interested in that, and then also it's actually kind of interesting looking at the categories. So I study photochemistry of organic molecules, which seems like it fits under the organic chemistry. It's photochemistry isn't really listed in physical chemistry. So I guess I'm saying, can you talk a little bit about how you related your work to petrochemical products in some way, and then how you kind of identified your area, because they're sort of, I think of myself as a physical chemist, but I might wind up calling myself an organic chemist in this categorizing. So I'm wondering if you find yourself in a similar situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're also, well, so several folks, at least a couple of folks here are interdisciplinary, I would say.
Yeah. So you said photo, and like my heart sung. So I am a photochemist, or photophysicist. Depends on how I want to describe myself. And so really my bread and butter is designing new compounds, right? That can do things, right? And to be honest, I get more excited about designing the compounds than about like actually testing them for the applications, but that is kind of the long-term goal. So that's how I thought about it. It's like, okay, I want to make these compounds and they would be useful for these things. And one of the things that my first iteration of a PRF, one of the things that the reviewers commented on was that I had said applications, but like very vaguely, right? Instead of really showing what kinds of reactions I would test these photocatalysts for, right? And that really helped, because then I had at least some reactions that I could say, okay, once we make these compounds, we are going to test them using these reactions, right? And they may not be the most exciting reactions, but you can at least say, okay, these actually work for something, right? And the way I thought about it was a lot of the compounds that I work with, and this is part of my previous experience, can be used for photoredox catalysis. And photoredox catalysis is all about valorizing hopefully cheap molecules that you can get from petroleum distillates and stuff like that. So that was my kind of entry into the petroleum relevance.
So you were sort of studying something that might then apply to a petrochemical product, but not currently is applied to a petrochemical
Correct.
product.
Yes.
Okay.
So for me, it's more about, kind of the end goal is if I can make these compounds, and when we have them, we can use them to catalyze reactions that involve petrochemical compounds.
Okay.
And maybe this is the moment when Allegra realizes that this was not relevant enough and they pull my funding, but it worked. So.
No, that's petroleum relevant. Let's see. Wade, do you want to go next?
Yeah, as far as petroleum relevance, it's really a pretty easy sell most of the time if you're working with organic compounds. Is everybody on this call organic-ish? I can't remember.
No, we could
Okay.
have, we're all fields of chemistry and some geoscientists.
Oh, nice.
So,
Well, welcome. So maybe what I'm saying won't be that relevant to all of you. But for me as an organic chemist, the fact that I'm using, organic chemists, the vast majority of the chemicals, the vast majority of them are derived from petroleum. So the fact that you're using something that's derived from petroleum to do your experiment. So if, even if your substrates are organic derived, I think that's, enough that you can probably sell it.
Okay.
yeah, for organic chemists, I would say it's basically like almost all organic chemicals are good. No DNA, no amino acids. But yeah, most like, bulk organic chemicals, you'll be fine.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's something that's changed since I've been applying to PRF is the focus on the substrates has really gone up, what compounds you're working with. And the long term, for me as a synthetic organic chemist, I want somebody to use my chemistry to build a biologically active molecule. That is, I think, not very interesting to PRF at all. They don't care that, that's probably too strong of a phrasing for it, but they don't want to see total synthesis. They don't want to see anything medicinal or biological impact. They want to see what you can do to the molecules themselves. That's my interpretation anyway.
Yes, that's the way we interpret fundamental. So if it has to do with biological activity, that's considered applied, like within a biological context. And then total synthesis is interesting because it can involve petroleum-derived chemicals. The main challenge there is something Wade mentioned earlier, which is that like if you complete a total synthesis, it can be hard to see where you would take the chemistry next as a new direction. It seems just sort of like a 2 years and then it's done forever sort of thing. So it's just sort of hard to frame those projects to sound like they'll have legs beyond the funding period. Any other questions for the panelists?
I guess I could have another question in terms of thinking about a new direction. So if I've studied a mechanism under, for whatever, let's say at a given pH in certain conditions, because that's been a good place to start, and I want to move to new pH, new ionic strength, new solvent, is that a new direction?
You would have to, I would run it by the program officer with more details. Like if you're investigating the mechanism specifically and the mechanism will likely change dramatically, I would say you could potentially justify that as a new direction. But you would have to sort of make the case that something about it is going to be a bit of in some way, a departure from what you've done before to bring some new expertise to your group. Okay, I see a question about organic synthesis and organic structure. Yeah, I think because we have 2 organic E panels, that can be a bit sort of tricky to sort of pick a home in some sense. I would say the like organic structures, dynamics, and mechanisms is our new name for like physical organic. So those are the people those are like the fundamental organic chemists. Everything is fundamental, but I would say that's more so. That's doing mechanistic studies like solvolysis. That's sort of like that's often where photochemistry and or sort of like radical mechanistic studies might go, whereas the organic synthesis would be a little bit more focused on more complex molecules and a bit more practical, like creating more efficient synthetic methods or catalysts or things like that. So, something more elaborate structures, I would say. And then one last question for our panel, either with a raised hand or in the chat. Tulio, did you unmute?
Yes, I am on mute. So I have a question. In your presentation, I found that there are say that the ACS PRF, no preliminary data is required to submit
Correct.
one grant. It is absolutely correct at this time.
That is correct.
It is because for several years I don't submit nothing because one of the comments from the reviewers in one of my applications was that I don't have enough publications to support the experiments I propose in my grant. So then I stopped really to submit, but it is new for me and I found, interesting at this time. So then don't need in that case at this time.
You do not. And we coach the panelists. We mentioned to reviewers that preliminary results are not needed, but they'll often comment on it anyway. But the reviewers are not the decision makers. The panelists are, and the panelists sort of enforce the no preliminary results are needed policy for themselves. I would say I would consider reaching out to a program officer. And in the case where people, even though the reviews say no preliminary results are needed, like the panel could have a different interpretation, but that's where talking to the program officer after getting the funding decisions can be helpful, because they can sort of frame it as like, you know, did the panel think that it didn't appear feasible enough with or without preliminary results, or did the panel just disregard those comments entirely, which they can do in their rankings.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much to everybody for joining today. Thank you. A double thank you to the panelists, Danny, Leslie, and Wade. I really appreciate your perspectives.